Thank you so much for that beautiful welcome. I may be a little emotional at the beginning of my talk. I am extremely glad to be here today with fellow progressives, with activists, with cultural workers, and with freedom fighters. It's both an honor and a gift. Over the past several weeks, I've been grieving the loss of my father. Some of you who do work in health or prisons may have known him, Stephen Whitman. And there's something very appropriate about the fact that I'm here today because he was a man of extraordinary conviction and courage who dedicated his entire life's work to the cause of fighting injustice and inequality. And he was a New Yorker from Flatbush. And it's also the 90th birthday of another important freedom-fighting New Yorker, James Baldwin. So it's a special day. So I'm going to begin by talking about two words that shape so many of our discussions, injustice and inequality. And these are complex words. So let's take inequality to begin with. When we say that we want to confront inequality, that that's part of our work, right, that we want to fight against us, we might be talking about any number of things. We might be talking about economic inequality, rising economic inequality, on the local level, on the domestic level, on the international level, and on the global level. We might be talking about racial inequality, right, in which we see the aggregation of benefits or adversity based on race. We might be talking about gender inequality or patriarchy or inequality based upon sexual identity. We might be talking about inequality of opportunity or inequality of outcome. Right? The word takes on so many different valences precisely because we live in a profoundly unequal world. And the challenge for those of us who believe in every person's right to live in dignity, safety, and with meaning and joy is to keep hold of some sense of all of these forms of inequality at once, even as we may find ourselves working on a single issue or a set of issues or problems or from a certain perspective, right? And we have to keep hold of this because we have to maintain a commitment to the larger end, right? Which means that we have to pay attention to a great deal of suffering that lies beyond where our labors in the immediate moment lie. Now, oftentimes when we talk about inequality as a problem, we're naming it as a problem because of this other ambiguous concept, justice or injustice. Right? Injustice is complex because the word justice is complex. Right? So for many of us here, I think for probably all of us here, when we talk about justice, we're talking about fairness. But the word oftentimes also means revenge or punishment. An eye for an eye, some form of remediation. It can also mean a kind of dispassionate calculation of remedy that we so often see in courts, a kind of justice that so often doesn't speak in any profound way to the suffering that initiated the judgment in the first place. So we bandy about these difficult words. And perhaps one of the reasons that organizing is so difficult in this moment, although you all are doing it incredibly and beautifully, but it is difficult work, is part of the difficulty I think in the present moment has to do with our imprecision. We use these words, right? When we say that something is unjust or unequal enough that it forces us to act. So I'm going to talk specifically about racial inequality, but I think this has what I'm going to say has implications that are broader, and I'll explain why. I wrote this book, More Beautiful and More Terrible. It comes from a James Baldwin quote where he says American history is larger, longer, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever written about it. And the initiating premise of the book was the following. So we live in this society today that proclaims racism is bad. It's a bad thing. Racial bigotry is bad. No one wants to be called a racist. In fact, people are often more concerned with the stigma of being called a racist than the stigma that leads to people being victimized by race, right? More concerned about, you don't want to be a racist, but not so concerned about racism. So we live in a place that proclaims a commitment to racial egalitarianism, and yet we see time and time again that racial inequality doesn't simply exist and persist, but it is sustained in our social practices. And so a big part of what I'm trying to do, in the book is to say, okay, how is it that we say we have this value and yet we act in the exact opposite fashion, right? And this is important because, for a long time people talked about institutional and structural inequality and racism, and those things are important. But it's also important to note that people behave in ways that extend what those institutional forms do, and that institutions are created and sustained by people, right? So, people are at work all the time with respect to this issue. And so racial inequality is sustained by the way that we treat people. And I say we because part of what I identify is that this is a cultural pattern, right? This is a cultural practice. So it's not in a simple form of there's one group against the other. In fact, there are groups that are in the aggregate are treated better or worse by people in general, even members of their own group, right? So it's a cultural practice. It is a deeply American cultural practice, right? Where we say one thing and we do something very different. Now, the way I establish this in the book is I actually read multiple bodies of research. So I'm looking at neuroscience, I'm looking at consumer studies, I'm looking at media studies, I'm looking at cognitive psychology, I'm looking at sociology, I'm looking at economics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I find in all these bodies of research, whenever anybody studies how people treat each other on the basis of race, there are certain groups that are systematically disadvantaged. Now, the limitation of this, and in virtually all these areas, what you see consistently is the blacker or the darker you are, you're at the bottom in terms of you're most mistreated. Now, part of the limitation I was going to say about this is that there's not disaggregation on the basis of ethnicity, by and large, for either Latinos or Black Americans. And so there's not enough fine-honed analysis of what's happening to different groups of people of color. You have a little bit more data about Latinos and Asian Americans on a national stage because the census actually tracks ethnicity. After the first generation, Black people, unless you were born in another country, it's just one big group on the census, right? So there's no disaggregation. So there's limitations, unless you have like kind of deep ethnographic analysis, there's limitations in terms of the kind of nuances of what we see. But in general, we see things like this, right? So that doctors, irrespective of the race of the doctor, right, are less likely to order tests for Black patients than white. Right? We see that employers are less likely to hire Latinos or African Americans than white people with identical qualifications. We see this in studies that look at names, but we also see this in like fieldwork studies where people actually go in and turn in a resume and we see the response. We see things like juries and judges are both more likely to recommend harsher sentences for darker-skinned defendants, irrespective of race, right? Black people on average pay more than others for the same car or house or mortgage. And in particular, the subprime mortgage lending crisis devastated Latino communities. The highest rate of home loss is a function of this. And I'm speaking here of instances where all other things are equal. Right? So if we also consider the accumulation of disadvantage from colonialism, Jim Crow, neo-colonial systems of exploitation, being undocumented, et cetera, right, the picture is far more grim than even what this evidence suggests. But in the book, I wanted to stay away from talking as much about the kind of residual impacts of this deep old inequality because I wanted to focus attention on how we produce racial inequality even as we nominally reject it, because the way that we reproduce this means that any effort to remedy it will fail, right? Because we say one thing and we consistently do another. And I focused on a number of ways we do it. And so I talked about the prevalence of racial narratives that we tell about people and places, and how these narratives lead to kind of pervasive practices of devaluation, whether that is the neighborhoods that people live in, whether that is the families that people live in, whether it is the school, the children in a school, right? I talk about narratives like this group doesn't value education, right? Or these families are all broken, or even simple terms like bad neighborhood or ghetto, right? And I also talk about categories, words like illegals, criminals, fatherlessness. These words are not just popular discourse, they work their way into policy initiatives. And they work their way into policy in very insidious ways because the language and the way these popular discourses, which I know we're all familiar with, shapes what kinds of policies get enacted. They're words that are used to describe categories of people that aren't simply reducible to race. They have no race on their face, but of course which have racialized images attached to them. And they have racialized images attached to them that include stories that are often rife with sensationalistic and paranoid and prurient accounts of disorder, violence, and hypersexuality. Okay? So the work of these categories and narratives is not simply trafficking in stereotypes, but of course they are that, but they also are guides for how people, they operate as guides to tell people how you're supposed to treat members of those communities, how you're supposed to treat people in those categories, right? What your relationship should be to them, right? So for example, when we see that judges are less likely to release juveniles who have committed some offense to their parents if they're Black or Latino than if they're white, right? Or when we see that child removal from parents is more likely in those communities, everything else being equal, we know that there are stories operating in the minds of those decision makers that are at work, right? You can't release the parents the parents are irresponsible, can't release them to the custody of the parents, gotta lock them up, right? That's the logic, right? We see this and we see these patterns everywhere in schools, consumer purchases, restaurants, traffic stops, everywhere. I mean, even the data about restaurants alone is extraordinary, right? And they measure what the quality of service is, right? And everybody has stories, but when you look at in aggregate, it's extraordinary, right? Because we have a country where nobody wants to be racist. Now, part of what happens when we say that the sort of statement, we believe in racial equality, we don't believe in racism, has to do with what we're talking about. The problem is what we're talking about when we say that, right? And oftentimes, the image of what racism is, or racial inequality is a sense of biological determinism, right? So this is an old-fashioned way that racism works. That person belongs to that group, and therefore they are biologically inferior or biologically predisposed to X, Y, or Z. Now, those ideas are still around, but they're not the majority, right? Or people say racism is when you have overwhelming animus. I call this like Jerry Springer show type racism. And I don't know if you all remember, he used to have, and see, I'm showing my age. He used to have people come on, like the Klan come on the show, and then they would act out, and then he would get in fistfights with them, and there would be a melee, and that, people are fighting that kind of racism, but that's not actually how it tends to work today. And so there's a problem with this idea that practices of racial inequality, and I call it that as opposed to racism often in most places of the book, simply because I want people to be aware that these are decisions that are being made consistently, right? It doesn't have to do with your attitude necessarily. It's not a matter simply of values, right? Because if we allow that idea that it resides at the level of values, then if a person says, well, I think racism is bad, I'm committed to the value that we are all equal, then that person gets to be innocent. Okay? And Americans in general have to get over this passionate attachment to innocence, this idea of innocence, right? We do, because it keeps us passively destructive. Right? We say we see no evil, right? Or we don't have evil eyes, right? Or an evil gaze. And then we avoid responsibility. Right? So when racial inequality is a cultural practice, then we share collective responsibility, and we're all implicated in it. Right? And I say we, and sometimes. And I'll just be really frank, like Ray, sometimes a black person talking about racism will say we as a kind of act of generosity, but I really do mean we, all of us. I mean me too. And I'll give an example, right? So as a privileged, highly educated, straight, cisgendered black woman, right, when I walk through the world, armed with all sorts of things that people I encounter say defy stereotype, right? From my clothes to my vocabulary word-filled English. I speak standard English, at least in public. Right? When I do this, knowing that I will be treated better, right, than the black trans woman, sex worker, right, person who's speaking African American vernacular English as their primary mode of communication, right? I'm implicated in the practices of inequality as well, right? Every time I take advantage of that without kind of interrogating, without trying to disrupt it. And the people who treat me better than this or that other black woman they encounter because I'm acceptable are implicated as well, right? So all of us have to get over the fictions of innocence and the misbelief that racial inequality is simply a matter of values. Another primary error is that we confuse animus for inequality. And so having negative feelings, you know, kind of Archie Bunker type thing, right? Having negative feelings, see again, I'm just stuck in the 70s and 80s. Having negative feelings about every member of a group or operating towards a group with prejudice is generally, you know, we can agree bad values because you shut off possibility, right? But that kind of attitude is something that can be surmounted with knowledge, right? With developing relationships that challenge stereotypes, friendship, et cetera, family connections. Inequality is a much thornier and damaging reality. It goes far deeper than attitudes or animus. It goes to opportunity, to suffering, and even to the likelihood of death. So, that's some brief accounting of some of the points in the book, but I want to really use the remainder of my time today to think about how this situation creates impediments, what I think the practices of racial inequality, how they create impediments to the work of social justice organizing, whether it be organizing specifically around issues of racial inequality or around the kind of larger matrix of inequality that I spoke of at the very beginning. So one, racial narratives produce perceptions of incompetence and irrationality that often make sharing power or listening or assuming competence, knowledge, and capacity, right, in communities of color, or generally assuming competence, knowledge, and capacity in all parties participating in a given moment or organizing over a particular issue, the racial narratives that are at work are often impede the recognition of the full humanity and possibility of all members who are organizing around a given issue. Right? And so I'm going to be a little controversial now, but I'm going to. So for example, in the present moment where we have a national push to privatize public education, and in some cities public education has been eradicated, and it's being pushed by corporations who are really invested in union busting, I think, and also are concerned about real estate. In the midst of that, right, you have the part of what's happening in terms of privatizing, the teachers most likely to be fired, right, experienced teachers, union teachers most likely to be fired are black women, right, and the Teach for America kids, right, are not, right, they're young and affluent and white for the most part, right. Even though the discourse around school reform centers around children of color. Because I always talk about the achievement gap, right? So we're talking about the achievement gap, but not talking about the role of adults in that community, or the essential of adults in those communities, in responding to that. But also, at present, at least on the national stage, and I know this is different city by city, the voices in opposition to privatization are also disproportionately white, right? So even though the debate is around urban schools, right? And I don't offer that example to suggest that there's a nefariousness on either part. I have lovely students who choose to be involved in these reform efforts despite my guidance at times. I don't think there's any nefariousness, but I think that's an example of where we can see visually that organizing that is taking place with children of color at the very center doesn't include real power sharing in terms of activism, right? And we ought to always be concerned about that because the resistance to power sharing has everything to do with racial narratives about competence, about ability, about knowledge. Right? We have to get past, and so we have to push through that. Even the concept of coalition politics can be difficult to reconcile with this political and economic moment. And it's not entirely, I hope by the time I get through this paragraph, what I'm saying will be clear, right? So the reality is that our current economic model, neoliberalism, is defined in large part by the gospel of the market, right? So everything that used to be, we assume were appropriate government functions, we gotta have a market for it, we gotta have competition. Competition makes things better, right? So everything is being marketized. And that marketization of everything shapes the kinds of citizens or residents we must be, right? Because we're constantly being forced into a competitive marketplace in every single aspect of our lives. Right? The hostility to organized labor, to bureaucratic structures in this moment must be in part attributed to this sense that the wild west of the market is always best. And this is a gospel that is preached by both the Democrat and Republican parties, at least on the national stage. Right? They're both accountable. And when we live within a competitive framework in every aspect of our lives, then we're constantly looking for some advantage, right? Any advantage. Right? When we're driven to that level of competition, you can imagine how people want to trade on identities that provide historical advantage, right? And also, this is spatial, it's geographic, right? So when we see how much occupational and residential segregation there is, right, so much so that even in the same company, right, your color might dictate what job you have in that company, right? It's hard for people to organize in ways that allow them to forego potential advantages, right, in order to cast their lot with someone who has fewer advantages. Now, we might say this has always existed, but I would argue that it's exacerbated now. It's worse now. And it's worse now because all of us are vulnerable. When the Occupy movement, when they talked about that 1%, right, the sense of kind of fungibility, the casualization of labor, that kind of pervasive vulnerability that is growing for all but the most elite, makes it very difficult for people to really grapple with the prospect of giving up some advantage in order to struggle in a collective, right? So a coalition that might work, for example, to protect their neighborhood, their communities against environmental hazards, right? Or hold their school boards accountable, are made fraught and vulnerable by the fear that everyone today is open to possible devastation, right? So not in our backyard can easily become, maybe you should put it in their backyard, right? Since 2009, the relative wealth, and it depends on what metric you use, but the relative wealth of African Americans to white Americans is half, right? Something, so it used to be 1/10, now it's 1/20. So for 40 years, the black unemployment rate has been twice that of the general population, but now we have half as much wealth as we had before, which was just so we're going to 1/10 to 1/20. But also the entire American middle class is increasingly fragile. Right. The youth of Honduras are fleeing devastating violence, coming to this country in part because of economic policies that we've had in their country. American sympathy wanes as Americans fear losing their fledgling existences to people even more vulnerable, right? Someone more vulnerable might be willing to do more for this dollar rate. As opposed to, there's this real impediment to sort of imagining ourselves working together, right, across difference in these circumstances. It's got to be deeply individualistic, deep sense of vulnerability. So that's one piece. Second, if you remember, I began by talking about the vagaries of the word justice. And even as we say, in many instances, justice fails today. The rich get richer, etc. But justice, in the sense of a system of punishment, is quite robust, right? We have the highest per capita prison population in the world. And of that group, African Americans are the most disproportionately imprisoned, making the racial group I belong to most likely to be the most imprisoned population on the face of the earth. Right? Now, I don't necessarily know that because you'd have to do like the math part. You have to do an analysis of the demographics of the prison population in each country to be sure, but I think that's a speculation that is likely to be confirmed. My colleague, Naomi Morikawa, who has an important book coming out on the building of prison America, has also been working on what she talks about as the shadow carceral state, which details the way undocumented people, civil penalties, or violations of undocumented people are kicking into criminal charges and incarceration and detention. It's a massively growing dynamic as well. Right? So criminalization today in general is the way we often deal with social problems. Right? But criminalization is also deeply racialized. So when we use criminal law, we seek criminal law to do the problem of creating justice, we find ourselves deeply embedded in inequality, even as we're fighting against it. And for those of us who are feminists, this is a particular problem. Right? Much of the work of the feminist movement that has been successful, and much of the aspirations have failed, but it's been in criminal causes of action, right, as opposed to transforming culture and society, right? And it's a problem because those who are punished for wrongdoing that is associated with masculine domination are often men who are in some other way being dominated, not those who are dominating all of us, right? Even though men of all groups participate, and sometimes women, in these forms of domination. So our response is often more punitive than it is to transform cultures of violence. So our conception of justice has to transform, right? And the other side of the problem is that we leave entire populations who are vulnerable to gender violence out of the consideration of protection because they aren't understood as victims, right? So here I'm thinking of, for example, that the highest rate of sexual assault is experienced by women who are sex workers, in particular women of color who are sex workers, women who are incarcerated, women who are undocumented. These are populations who are vulnerable in ways that actually don't allow them to see remedies, right? So justice itself, at least with respect to criminal justice, must be approached with care. The very concept of what we want to see happen must constantly include multiple concerns in our minds at once. And finally, we have to set, and this is part of what I argue in the book, is we have to transform our sense of our we if we want to be successful in organizing across these lines of difference. And that means a sense of we that is at once beyond broader identity categories and citizenship, and actually thinking about the structure of power, the structure of inequality, and also the absence of accountability for those who are in positions of authority, right? So how do we do that? I want to give some terms and then several examples. Let me just check my time. Okay. One is a concept that I think is really useful, which is asset-based community development, and I think it provides you there, like that, right? Right? A model of actually taking inventory and assuming that there are multiple members of it, that everyone in a community has assets, right? How do we take an inventory of that in order to transform our communities and our society? Second is a practice of consciousness raising. You know, people often get frustrated. Why are we always talking? We need to do. But we actually have to think in new ways now. So we actually have to do the work of thinking, because so often the way that we act is ultimately self-defeating. We have to resist the tendency to always go to individual competition and actually, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but really encourage a more robust engagement with the idea of organizing, organized labor, organized people. And finally, to think about the ecologies of protest. And by that I mean, how are all these issues interrelated? And that's, I think, incredibly important for the question of elections, right? We're not just votes or commodities, we are constituencies, which means that we have to have a set of values and issues beyond the election cycle. And it's having that sense of values and issues beyond the election cycle that actually allow us to hold elected officials accountable. Right. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to give a couple of examples that I think are useful from the past, and perhaps I'll get to some from the present. Earlier this summer, I went to the 50th anniversary of Mississippi Freedom Summer in Jackson, Mississippi, on the campus of Tougaloo College. And it was an extraordinary experience. It was beautiful. There were all these SNCC veterans, and they ranged in terms of what they were doing 50 years hence, right? So some were elected officials, some were activists, some were educators, some were talking about we have to build a movement for quality education as a constitutional right, et cetera, right? And many of them talked about the influence of Ella Baker, who was the mother of SNCC, who was an activist who was the mother of SNCC. And one of the greatest moments of my youth was actually, and by this time she was already senile, but taking Ella Baker to the park several times. Anyway, that's an aside. That's just the highlight of my life. And she taught, but her model of leadership was not top-down. She was skeptical of charismatic leadership. She said strong people don't need strong leaders. And her model was one of participatory democracy. The model of SNCC that they carried through her vision was always based in cultivating local leadership. These young people who came down south were not telling the folks in Mississippi what to do. They were facilitating spaces for the cultivation of local leadership, right? In Mississippi, but also in South Carolina and Alabama, multiple places where there were freedom schools, where there were citizenship schools, learning, right, this kind of practice of citizenship was part of building the backbone of the organizers to face an arduous battle, right? And they were deliberate, day-by-day work over long periods of time, right? Difficult work. Dottie Zellner, I don't know how many of you saw the Freedom Summer movie that aired on PBS, but she says, interestingly, in that documentary, she said there were lots of us, white folks, who came down south, but it was a black movement. Right? The capacity to say that is pretty extraordinary, right? And it's instructive, right? Because it was a movement. It was a movement about Jim Crow. And I think, thinking about power sharing, but also thinking about the kind of collective practices, shifting a we, being comfortable being part of a we that does not centralize one's identity, right, or one's privilege, is an important model. Second model I'll give is of Mel King, who is a long-standing community leader in Boston, born of Caribbean parents in Boston, went to college down south, comes back up to Boston, becomes a teacher for a while, and then decides he's going to be an organizer. And he leads a sit-in of the Boston Redevelopment Authority's site office because of an urban renewal project. And the city was going to raise homes, we know this story, in the name of development and removing blight, and replace them with a parking lot. And this is a community that was historically black and Latino that was being rapidly gentrified. And they sat out in a parking lot in the south end of Boston and created a tent city, which is now a multi-income housing development, and perhaps the only multi-income location in the South End. That's an exaggeration, but and then he runs for mayor multiple times. He's elected to the state legislature, and he works explicitly on issues of racial justice, tenant rights, gay rights, and women's rights. So he builds what he calls a rainbow coalition. You've heard this term. In 1983, term borrowed from Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, right, over a decade earlier, and then subsequently borrowed by Jesse Jackson in his 1988 bid for president. I'm gonna stop here, but there are multiple examples, and the examples that I think, the reason I want to give these examples is because when you have models of power sharing, right, of shifting the we, of believing in the capacity of those who have been historically marginalized, who are subject to these categorical, these categories that are often quite vicious, right? Those are the moments that we can be transformed, and not just transform how people are seen, but actually be transformed in the process of working with others. Now, the examples that I give, and there are others that I think are really important, Moral Mondays in North Carolina, of course, the election of Ross Baraka in Newark, of course, the community school movement in the Bronx in the 70s, et cetera, et cetera. None of them have been simple victories or guaranteed victories, right? So there's a history of a long struggle around schools in New York, and today the schools in New York are the most segregated in the country, right? Dropout rates highest for young men of color. Newark has a new mayor, but it's not going to be like economically flourishing anytime soon. On the campus of the Mississippi Freedom Summer events, right, we're celebrating how, Voting Rights Act, all this transformation. There are prison laborers working on that campus, and they were all young black men, right? And working for something even below what we could call exploitation, right? North Carolinians are still going out without health care, right? Things are difficult, right? Right, are often confront retrenchment in every area of progress, right? That's part of what it means to live in an unequal society. It's part of what defines injustice. Our victories are short-lived, and they often turn into defeat. But we work with the belief that we might one day shift the balance of power. Right? So my argument is not about something so naive or arrogant as a map for victory. Obviously there are greater minds than me who've tried to figure that out. But rather, a revelation about one set of reasons about why it's so hard for us to get together, and also talking about how to seek inspiration as to how we might do it, regardless of how hard it often seems, because the struggle, in fact, is in the doing. Thank you.